welcome to Ecclesiastes. Pastor Steve is away in Las Vegas. He owns a home out there. His wife is from there. His daughter lives out there, so he's out getting a little R&R, and he asked me to fill in for him. So I think we're going to have a great night tonight. It's an excellent passage for what Ecclesiastes is. Ecclesiastes is not always the really bright sunshine kind of book. It's kind of like an emotional roller coaster. The author is giving you a very real, a very raw account of just the way life is, particularly the fallen world. And he's not candy coating anything. It's a real dose of realism. You might even argue pessimism, because he is kind of God's antidote to the pie in the sky. Everything happens to you you're good. If you're good, only good things happen to you. So it's the antidote for that. But let's open up with a word of prayer, and then we'll jump right on in. Father, I thank you so much for your word, for your people, God. I pray that you would take your word and bless your people, instruct your people, empower your people, connect with your people so that they can take what we've learned here tonight and use it to be doers of your word so that they might be better at living life, connecting with other people, maybe even empathizing with people, God. Help us to learn your word, uncover everything that we need to see, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So it's a little weird for me right now. I have a lot of things attached to me. I feel really tethered. And I'm used to being down here, so we're going to see how this works out. I may end up shouting because I'm like instinctually used to shouting when I'm here because of the lack of microphone. Well, Pastor Steve, as always, he leaves a quiz, so we will look at that first. So let's begin with the quiz number 5. The teacher keeps returning to seeing one source of joy being what? A, wealth, B, physical pleasure, C, toil, or D, wisdom. What does Kohelet keep returning to? The answer is toil. He sees the one source of joy being toil. Then number 2, what advantage does the laborer have over the wealthy person? A, a good family, B, a short life, C, a strong body, or D, a good night's sleep. I must not be laboring at all. I rarely sleep. I don't know. I may have to revisit what I'm doing. Maybe a little more physical exercise. Number 3, when I come to the house of God, I should A, come with a sacrifice, B, be slow to speak, C, be quick to listen, or D, come with a song. Well, according to Steve, it's B and C. We want to be slow to speak and be quick to listen. There's a saying, God has given us twice as many ears as he has a mouth, so we should listen twice as much as we speak. And I don't know if the people over here can see the screen clearly, but you feel free to move. Number 4, the sacrifice of fools is A, bringing the wrong animal, B, foolish chatter, C, many words, or D, harming your neighbor. What do you think? Two of them, B and C, foolish chatter and many words. They kind of go hand in hand. Number 5, be careful to A, fulfill your vows to God, B, hesitate in making vows to God, C, not claim a vow was a mistake, or D, fear the Lord. You know, one of them there's one that should surely be right. Looks like all of them are right. Yeah, I'd say all of those are true. I mean, if you vow something, follow through. You shouldn't enter into a vow quickly or rashly. You need to think this through. Or C, don't pretend like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. If you've done it, this is why it's important to enter into it, soberly. And finally, D, we should always be careful to fear the Lord. 6, if the poor are oppressed, A, look for the fool, B, it is because of their laziness, C, look at the people above them, or D, consider the actions of the king. It is C and D. Yeah, it's good. Number 7, if you love money, you will A, be blessed, B, never know sadness, C, never have enough, or D, be consumed by it. I suspect C and D are right. Number 8, I was born naked and I will A, clothe myself in righteousness, B, wear the garment of praise, C, leave this earth naked, or D, toil to clothe myself. It is C. Yeah, you've brought nothing into the world, you'll take nothing out, so the saying goes. Or you'll never see a U-Haul behind a hearse. I mean, those are things you just don't encounter. Number 9, which of the following adds to satisfaction in life? A, eating, B, drinking, C, toilsome labor, or D, pursuit of wisdom? Yeah, you know what's interesting about this guy? For a person who authors wisdom literature, at times he has a very low view of wisdom or what it can do. So eating and drinking, that can bring some satisfaction, I suppose, if it depends on what the food tastes like. I've had some that was very unsatisfying. The worst thing is, if I pay a modest price for something, then I'm like, I don't expect a lot. But if I pay a lot for something and it's just mediocre or worse, then it bothers me. And sometimes our work really adds a little satisfaction. Toilsome, I don't know about, but we'll see. Number 10, the teacher says it is better to be A, born, B, stillborn, C, dead, or D, healthy. Yeah, this is not what you would expect, you would think. I guess he's wanting to avoid problems, but it's almost as if Kohelet is so overwhelmed by things, he just thinks you're better off never having, opened your eyes. How many got all 10? All right. Gus, I don't know. How many never lie in this class? Yeah, 7.5, okay. That's not bad, that's not bad. Well, we're going to start with chapter 7. Steve said, Nathan, you can go through chapter 8. And I looked at 29 verses and I said to myself, maybe I could get to chapter 8, but I just don't think it's going to, I'm not going to push it. But I don't want him to miss out on the joy of teaching just one more chapter of Ecclesiastes. So Steve's loving this book, but Steve loves most Bible books. I actually think it's a great book too, but it's not something you would point a person to who's going through depression right at the beginning. What you point a person to is that they see that life is raw. It's not always what we think it is. And so let's just jump right on into the text. I want to just say very quickly that chapter 7 opens up the first 14 verses with 7 good or better sayings. You may want to jot this down. 3 are in the first 4 verses. You've got 1 in verses, you'll find 5 and 6, and there 1 in 8 through 10, and 1 in verse 11, and 1 in verse 14. Now, what do I mean by good or better sayings? Well, this Hebrew word tov, you might transliterate it T-O-V, it means good. It can mean a lot of things, but in each one of these verses, or sets of verses, you will see the word good or better appear. And we'll note that as we go along. I'm going to come back to this PowerPoint, but let me escape it just for a second. And I want to jump over here and we're going to look at the text. And I'm just going to read through the text once and then we're going to talk about it. So Ecclesiastes chapter 7, a good name is better than fine perfume, and the day of death better than the day of birth. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting. For death is the destiny of everyone. The living should take this to heart. Frustration is better than laughter, because a sad face is good for the heart. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure. It is better to heed the rebuke of a wise person than to listen to the song of fools. Like the crackling of thorns under the pot, so is the laughter of fools. This too is meaningless. Extortion turns a wise person into a fool, and a bribe corrupts the heart. The end of a matter is better than its beginning, and patience is better than pride. Do not be quickly provoked in your spirit, for anger resides in the lap of fools. Do not say, why were the old ways better than these? For it is not wise to ask such questions. Wisdom, like an inheritance, is a good thing and benefits those who seek the sun. Wisdom is a shelter as money is a shelter, but the advantage of knowledge is this: wisdom preserves those who have it. Consider what God has done. Who can straighten what he has made crooked? When times are good, be happy, but when times are bad, consider this: God has made the one as well as the other. Therefore, no one can discover anything about their future. In this meaningless life of mine, I have seen both of these: the righteous perishing in their righteousness, and the wicked living long in their wickedness. Do not be over-righteous, neither be over-wise. Why destroy yourself? Do not be over-wicked, and do not be a fool. Why die before your time? It is good to grasp the one and not let go of the other. Whoever fears God will avoid all extremes. Wisdom makes one wise person more powerful than 10 rulers in a city. Indeed, there is no one on earth who is righteous, no one who does what is right and never sins. Do not pay attention to every word people say, or you may hear your servant cursing you. For you know in your heart that many times you yourself have cursed others. All this I tested by wisdom, and I said, I am determined to be wise, but this was beyond me. Whatever exists is far off and most profound. Who can discover it? So I turned my mind to understand, to investigate, and to search out wisdom and the scheme of things, and to understand the stupidity of wickedness and the madness of folly. I find more bitter than death the woman who is a snare, whose heart is a trap, and whose hands are chains. The man who pleases God will escape her, but the sinner she will ensnare. Look, says the teacher, this is what I have discovered, adding one thing to another to discover the scheme of things while I was still searching but not finding. I found one upright man among 1,000, but not one upright woman among them all. This only have I found: God created mankind upright, but they have gone in search of many schemes. All right. Now, what's interesting about this passage, or this chapter, is again, very typical Kohelet. It's like he's bipolar. He'll say something that makes perfect sense and then seemingly contradict it. He's all over the place, and here's what I want you to get about this. Kohelet in some ways is saying the world is naturally unnatural since the fall. It's messed up. We should just expect things to be messed up. Now, I also think he is, oftentimes we catch him in these mood swings, but he's trying to impart some wisdom, but then he'll turn around and kind of undermine it because he doesn't want you to get too confident in proverbial sayings. So, chapter 7 is a lot like traditional wisdom. Remember, we said that in the book of Proverbs, which precedes Ecclesiastes canonically, and there's a reason I think it's purposely put right before Ecclesiastes. You'll remember in Proverbs, wisdom builds a house. But in Ecclesiastes, the house falls apart. It's dilapidated. You see, the book of Proverbs is a collection of divinely inspired maxims or truisms. These are things that generally hold true. And I believe it's 100% divinely inspired, but divinely inspired to be maxims. These, so you train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he'll not depart from it. That generally holds true. But one of the problems in the ancient Near East was this thought that Proverbs weren't just maxims. Some people adopted these things as this will always be the case. The righteous will not suffer. They'll never, or the wicked will never prosper, or something like that. Except that the wicked do prosper. Now, maybe not ultimately. I understand that. But this is the problem that Job faced. His friends said, surely, Job, you've done something wrong, because that was the proverbial wisdom of time. Nothing like this could happen to you unless you've done something wrong. It's like pulling the right lever. If you're a good person, only good things happen. If you're a bad person, bad things happen. But you see, and you'll see hints of this in chapter 7, except that Kohelet's very clear. There are no guarantees about the outcome. I mean, you think this would be true, and sometimes it is, but he'll turn around and undermine it immediately. So I want you to kind of have this in your mind, because Proverbs, when people seize on Proverbs to be more than maxims, and like 100% of the time, every time, only good things are going to happen to the good and the wise, and only bad things, it's just not congruent with reality. I mean, the world we live in is fallen, and Kohelet is giving us a good dose of reality. Actually, probably some cynicism in here as well. But let's keep that in mind as we read. So let's start right out with verse 1. A good name is better than fine perfume, and the day of death better than the day of birth. What a strange thing to say. Now, this Hebrew text here could be rendered good oil. We're assuming perfume, but in the ancient world, you know, if you had an abundance of oil, it was a sign of wealth. It could be considered something like a blessing. If you're interested in knowing that, Job 29:6 or Proverbs 21:20 will tell you that it's a sign of wealth. So it could just be oil. But what on earth about this thing, the day of death better than the day of birth? Why would you say something like that? And then look at verse 2. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting. For death is the destiny of everyone. The living should take this to heart. What is this guy getting at, do you think? Well, that's maybe one way to look at it, that we, you know, for the Christian is everlasting life. Whether Kohelet has that in view or not, exactly, I'm not sure. But what he's saying is that, you know, death is a sure thing. And whereas this house of feasting, yeah, you may feast, you may not feast. But one thing you know at the end is you're going to die. And you need to live in such a way that it sobers you up. Recognize your own mortality might be a way of saying this in verses 1 and 2. Death is a sobering lesson better to be learned than feasting. If you want to learn about something, feasting is nice. I like to eat out. It's good. But you better think about your own mortality. That's a better lesson to learn, he's saying. And have you ever wondered what somebody would say at your funeral? Have you ever contemplated that? You know, it's weird now that I've gotten a little older. If you'd caught me in my 20s, I never thought about my death. In fact, I wouldn't do this kind of morbid math that I do now. I think about my age. I project about how long the average person will live, or members in my family, and I think, here's what percentage or proportion of my life has passed. I mean, has anyone ever done that? And I think to myself, what on earth am I doing? How am I living? It's almost, I look back at this big clock. We have a big clock here that tells us the time. And I watched Pastor Steve one time do this. He put a clock that was set with enough seconds that would represent the average human lifespan. And it started counting down. And he had it around his neck like a big necklace. And the thought is you only have so many seconds in your life, only so much time, only so many hours. How do you live your life in light of the fact that you're going to die? I'm very cognizant of my own mortality. I'm not afraid of heights still. As a kid, it's a miracle I'm not dead. I had no fear of anything. The only thing now is I'm more aware that I can die, and it puts the brakes on a few things. Like, I'm probably not likely to go parachuting. I would have done it a while back, but probably, I might do it, But if I do the math, the adrenaline rush, I'm doing a cost-benefit analysis, the adrenaline it just doesn't do as much for me now. Maybe if I got a little more thrill from it, I might do it. But there are certain things I would not do at all, like turning cartwheels on the edge of the roof or something silly like that. But I used to do that in our hayloft in the barn. So, and could have died. But that's just the way life. So consider your own mortality And this is a good lesson to be learned. It's better than learning about feasting. You know, if you're a foodie, that's nice. But consider about how much time you have. Because, and it's better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting. Well, have you ever been to a funeral service and you overhear what people say about the person who's died? What kind of life have they lived? I mean, what are people going to say about you and me? I've always wondered if I'll be able to listen in on that. You know, whether God will grant me that, you know. There'll probably be some people that really badmouth me and other people, oh, he was such a nice guy, and these kinds of things. But there's a better lesson to be learned at a funeral than at a feast. Does that make sense? Okay, let's move on. So verse 3 says, frustration is better than laughter because a sad face is good for the heart. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of the fools is in the house of pleasure. Now, what on earth is going on here? Well, though the face is sad, the heart may be glad. What I mean is that sadness is more appropriate than laughter given the whole of life. If you think about it, this is what Kohelet's saying. I'm not saying this, but Kohelet is going to tell you some things that you may not want to hear. He thinks it might be a little bit better if you consider all of life to be a little bit sad. And he's saying, prepare for adversity. When he says frustration, do you see this, is better than laughter? He's saying, rather than just make everything a nice little jovial time, you better be prepared for frustration. There were a group of philosophers, cynics were kind of like this. They said, consider the worst possible thing that could happen to you, they would say. The worst possible thing. And you should be meditating on that, because then if it happens, you're not shocked by it. You're prepared. Now, I pushed back when my philosophy professor told me this. I said, well, you know, I don't know how happy I would be if I was constantly contemplating the worst possible thing. So I don't know whether Kohelet has it right here or not, but this is exactly what he's thinking, though, when he's just kind of vomiting it out for us to consider. But there is some wisdom here. We should be prepared for adversity. You know, we should prepare because adversity will come whether you like it or not. And so we need to think about these things. Now, verse 4 says, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure. Now, this is referring to a banquet where those who attended engage in kind of self-indulgent behavior. You know, riotous drinking would be what's going on here. This kind of thing. So it's not just like, oh, we're just going to have a nice meal together. This is like, let's party it up. And so this is a reference to that. Yeah. Oh yeah, now this is a great, I used the term Kohelet. If you were here for chapter 1, I forgot about this and Steve warned me. So Kohelet probably means, it gets translated as teacher. A good way to translate it is congregator, the one who congregates, or the assembler. Some people will say preacher. I think teacher is probably more right because he's giving wisdom. So he's congregating people in the sense of teaching them something. So when you hear me use this Hebrew word Kohelet, what I mean is the teacher. Steve will constantly say the teacher, I'm assuming. I'll sometimes just slip up and say Kohelet. But when you hear me say Qoheleth, that's Kohelet. This is the congregator, and he is the guy who's, there are probably two people here, right? You get someone who sets up the whole thing, and then you get to see this other guy live it out, so to speak. But go back to, if you're questioning what I'm saying, go back to the very first lesson, chapter 1. I do a whole spiel on this. You will be thoroughly depressed because I give you exactly what I think Ecclesiastes is about. And it is a no-holds-barred deep dive into just the messiness of life. Okay, so the heart of the fool is but verse 5, it is better to heed the rebuke of a wise person than to listen to the song of fools. Now, this makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, this seems to make sense. But what is he saying? Well, part of what he might be saying is instant gratification doesn't yield long-term benefits. I mean, you might think that listening to the Song of Fools, whatever that is better, but it doesn't yield long-term benefits. In fact, sometimes it's better to be rebuked. Remember, the bruises of a friend, the beating up from a friend is much better than the flattery of people who don't really love you. And you might actually see this word song. I would probably insert the word flattery there. The song here is likely flattery. And this is going to be important because Kohelet, or the teacher, is going to come down and say, look, we've got to be very careful about listening to people who flatter us. You know, the ones who sing the song we want to hear. Turn on my favorite song, and it's usually all about me. You know? I remember one time that God spoke to my heart very clearly. And I was thinking about worship and praise and the word flattery. And God spoke to me about what the word flattery is. He says, it's polluted praise. To my heart, I felt that God spoke, flattery is polluted praise. In other words, it's an attempt by us to manipulate God into doing something. We do this as people all the time. You know, how to win friends and influence people. Sometimes we will try to manipulate people. You need to be very careful. The Bible has nothing good to say about the flattering tongue. And people will try to flatter you. But flattery is a means to an end, and the end is manipulation. And we do it to people all the time, but we're fooling ourselves if we think we can do it to God, and yet people try. We'll come into a place, we think if we push the right buttons, pull the right levers with God, we get whatever we want. And we can raise our hands and pretend to praise Him, say good things about Him, thinking that we're going to, but He knows our motives better than we do sometimes. And sometimes we say the things we say, not because we genuinely want to praise God and worship Him for who He is, but because of, well, He's a genie to us. And we're trying to rub the bottle the right way by singing the right song or saying the right words. We need to be very careful about that. You might be able to fool other people with flattery, but you won't fool God. So let's not offer up to God polluted praise. Let's let it be sincere. Amen? All right. Let me step down off the pulpit here for a second and move on. So it moves on to verse 6, and it says, like the crackling of thorns under the pot, so is the laughter of fools. This too is meaningless. Now, if you're cooking and you throw thorns, like you'll pick up shrubs and things like that, they burn very quickly. They make a lot of noise, but they don't really produce a lot of heat. They don't really get a lot done. And that's oftentimes how flattery works too. But people will laugh, foolish people will laugh about things. They're not taking into consideration the soberness, the sobriety that should come with life, especially if you realize you only have so much time on the earth. There's nothing wrong with having fun, but he's talking about foolish laughter here, and probably could even be connected with the Song of Fools here. You've got sounds going on, a song, the crackling sound. So what is he getting at? He's saying that this stuff, it may make some noise, but it doesn't produce a whole lot. It's not very effective of getting us at the things that we need. Just as thorns burn quickly and provide little heat, foolish laughter is short-lived and accomplishes little. Okay? Move on to verse 7. Extortion turns a wise person into a fool, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Now, what do you think this means? I mean, extortion turns a wise person into a fool, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Now, it could mean the first part of it. Sorry, I keep forgetting I've got this thing on. Extortion turns a wise person into a fool, because a wise person will tell you that extorting money is foolish. Now, it depends on how you translate this phrase, this verse actually. But it seems like oppression and injustice challenge the wisdom of the wise. The wise will tell you that you shouldn't do that, but when you see it going on and it seems so pervasive and the people that are committing it get away with it, it almost makes the sage, the teacher, look foolish. Now, another way you might take this is that, well, if that wise person buys into the money, so to speak, is willing to give into the extortion or become the extortionist, that's foolish. But I think that's not what it means. I think the second part is talking about that. And a bribe corrupts the heart. We would like to believe that if you're wise, you will do the right things, that you won't do any of these bad things. But it seems like people do it. And that can make the wisdom of the wise seem a little bit foolish because it doesn't always pan out. And again, this may be a way of undermining this traditional view of the way Proverbs function. That, life is good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. That's just the way it is. Well, there's more than that going on. So oppression and injustice challenge the wisdom of the wise. So, let's move on. The end of a matter is better than its beginning, and patience is better than pride. Do not be quickly provoked in your spirit, for anger resides in the lap of fools. Do you think the end of a matter is better than its beginning? What do you think? Really? Some marriages start out pretty good and end up pretty bad. What do you think? Yeah. So you always think the end is better than the beginning? I don't know. Well, what is he trying to say then? He might be talking about perspective. If you have a perspective of the outcomes, that should be considered better. What I mean is if you're looking at a matter, if you're trying to get to the perspective, remember how we said earlier that laughter and fun and mirth and all those things, sometimes that can be good. But the truth is, if you don't have the outcome in mind, if you don't have the perspective of the end, this is why this guy can say funerals are better than feasts. He's saying that the perspective of seeing the end is a much better perspective than just knowing the beginning. So I think that's probably what he's getting at. I think some things do start out better and end up worse, and some things start out bad and end up better, but the wisdom that you can glean from this, I think, is, and I think he's right on, is that you need to consider the whole matter with the end in mind, what you might call the teleological result. And I think, so this is probably a matter of perspective. Any thoughts or? Well, I have a friend. I joke on him all the time. He's young, he just turned 23, he's works as a consultant, sharp guy. I mean, just what's so great about him is he's never met an idea that he doesn't like. I mean, he will jump on anything. And part of that is just being young and impulsive. But as you get older, you realize you need to think this out to its logical conclusion. Think it through, because you can get into a lot of things. Now, what I love about him is he inspires me to try new things. That's good. Great guy. But he's gotten off target quite a few times because he wasn't thinking of the consequences of the outcomes. So we need to think about things with the perspective of the end in mind. I think that's probably better, and I think that's what the teacher or Kohelet, if you hear me say Kohelet, I mean the teacher is talking about. And I think number 9 makes a lot of sense, or verse 9, do not be quickly provoked in your spirit, for anger resides in the lap of fools. It does. And I have been very foolish lately. Let me tell you, was on a corticosteroid. Prednisone does this to me all the time, and I've come off of it, and then just 5 days ago, I started back on the corticosteroid. And one of the things I noticed almost immediately, besides being forgetful, and so far so good right now, I have to strain a little bit, but it's, but I lose patience. I mean, I was with my nephew and 2 friends the other day, and this guy had to be on his phone at the light. It had turned green for a while. And I'm like, is he gonna go, And then one of my friends in the back, she was like, why the road rage, the sudden road rage? Because she's not used to seeing me get upset about things. But it is foolish to allow ourselves to just have these easily provoked times in our life. We need to be where we're a little resistant to that. You don't want to have these outbursts of wrath. Now, we're human. If Kohelet or the teacher is teaching us anything, is that this is humanity. We do get like this. But he's saying it's foolish. You don't want to be the kind of person who has a quick temper. Has anyone ever accused you of having a quick temper? Okay. When I'm on prednisone in particular, I'm quick-tempered. And Proverbs often, going back to Proverbs, describes fools as having quick tempers. That's Proverbs 14:17, if you want to look it up, and even verse 29. And it says that the wise are slow to anger. That's Proverbs 16:32 and 19:11, if you're taking notes. Now, those are the ideals. And in Proverbs, you would think, if you just only read Proverbs and not Ecclesiastes, you're like, oh yeah, this is the way it is. But the truth is, we all mess up and we lose our temper sometimes. And Ecclesiastes will give you a dose of that. Well, then he goes on in verse 10 and says, do not say, why were the old days better than these? For it is not wise to ask such questions. What does he mean by this? Anybody have a thought on that? Have you ever met somebody who was just so nostalgic? Everything was better in the old days. You know? There are twin problems that people typically have. You'll have the one person who has amnesia and learns nothing from the past. They're only looking ahead. They learn nothing. That's the dilemma of, one horn of the dilemma is amnesia. But the other one is nostalgia. And I've seen this in churches, and I've seen this with people, and I've seen it with songs. You know, this song was so much better back then. Or this way of doing it was the best way. Everybody has something that we tend to enshrine. You know, you saw this with God's people, you know. They were making Jerusalem great again. In their minds, they're like the old way of Jerusalem. Oh, they wanted to go back to the old ways of Jerusalem. But sometimes things change. Sometimes the songs change. The newness of the song doesn't make it worse. It might connect with a younger person, for example. Or the way that we do things. There's a church I'm serving at right now, in addition to Shelter Rock, where they're really trying to consider, and they're doing this openly, which is good because they're not so resistant. But they had a church assessment that found that their board-based way of doing things, with church government and ministry, they have several boards, may not be as effective as team-based. But the question is, do you hang on to this old way if it isn't better? Now, I'm not saying one way or the other. I'm just saying that some people are very nostalgic. And it can be a bad thing to live in the past. So the teacher is telling us we can't live in the good old days all the time. I like the good old days, especially when they were good. But we tend to make things better than they were. And of course, the other ditch you could fall into, that's one ditch. The other ditch is having amnesia and not learning anything from the past. There's a lot we can learn from people who have gone before us and from history and our elders. We need to learn that and have it. But at the same time, we don't want to live so much in the past that we never move forward. Because one will be like an anchor that you're dragging and never lets you get forward, and the other one you'll be untethered completely and just float off into space. So you don't want amnesia and you don't want too much nostalgia. Excess of either one of them can be a problem. And so that's my take on verse 10. It's not wise to live in the past, to ask such questions, in the sense of being overly nostalgic. And then verse 11 says, wisdom like an inheritance is a good thing and benefits those who see the sun. Verse 12, wisdom is a shelter as money is a shelter, but the advantage of knowledge is this, wisdom preserves those who have it. Now, I'm not sure what to do with these two verses because I'm not sure if I'm in love with the way the NIV translated it. It could be something like this. Wisdom is a good thing, and inheritance is a good thing, or money, but having them both is better. I think that's probably the way, something like this. Because literally, it seems like it's saying that wisdom is good, but wisdom plus money are better. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Barbara is saying that the internet, Facebook, is sideways.
I don't know if I can fix that, Barbara. You're going to have to turn your laptop like this. Maybe we can fix it later. I don't know why it's doing that. I can take a quick look, but I'm not sure. This is, I'd asked about this earlier to see. Yeah, so from my view, it's showing it horizontally, but it's not rendering it that way, and I'm very sorry. Kohelet would have something to say about this, but I want to be able to fix it, but I suspect to fix it, I will have to cut the feed altogether. So, can you persevere? And maybe, I don't know if we can, after the fact, render it the other way. Is it possible to do that, I wonder? Okay. Didn't have my V8 today, so none of you know that reference probably. But this, wisdom is good, but wisdom plus money is better. Now, why would I say that? Because if you look at the very next verse, wisdom is a shelter as money is a shelter, it seems there's a kind of parallelism here in Hebrew. But the advantage of knowledge is this: wisdom preserves those who have it. Have you ever met a rich fool? Or a wise poor person? You know what's really good is if you're wise and you have money. Wisdom and wealth are much better when they're together. But you can, if you have wisdom, if you have knowledge, you can preserve your wealth. I've seen people come into money quickly, and you see it all the time with lottery. Yeah, who said lottery? Yeah, that's exactly right. How many times have you read a person coming into hundreds of millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars, or maybe just $1 million, and they're broke within a year? In fact, one guy this happened to, he struck it rich 2 times, and both times ended up broke. And actually some bad things happened. He lost some members of his family, they were murdered, all kinds of crazy things can happen. What I'm saying is that, and I don't know that guy personally, so I'm not going to say anything. God only knows. But too often, generically speaking, foolish people who come into money, a fool and his money are soon parted. It's just the truth. And a person could be poor and wise, yeah.
To me, I take it as money is an amplifier. Whatever you are, that's what you're going to be.
Yeah, money, that's a great way of saying it, and I've often said it myself. Money amplifies things that are already true. Power amplifies things that are already true. If you're a jerk, when you get power, you're just a more powerful jerk. You know, if you're a fool when you get power, you're a more effective fool. You will go into increasing levels of folly. And so it does amplify those things. But there is an advantage. I think it is better to be wise and have money. You can get more things done. But there's nothing wrong, and there's no guarantee that you will be wealthy. And if that wealth is going to pull you away from God, God forbid I should ever be wealthy. You know? So anyway, verse 13 says, "Consider what God has done. Who can straighten what he has made crooked when times are good?" Well, let me just stop with verse 13 because it's a little controversial. What might be going on here is that Kohelet, or the teacher, is saying the universe has wrinkles. Things are messed up, and only God can straighten them out. But now the question becomes, did he really make them crooked? And there are a couple of ways you can look at this. You might look at it as a very broad sense of sovereignty, that nothing is going to get by God, and he's in charge, and ultimately he's the one that can only ultimately bring everything out. I think that's a plausible way of looking at it. The other thing is to see that like this, that Kohelet lacks perspective. like we do. The teacher lacks perspective. He's not even sure about God half the time. What I mean is or what God thinks. And so in his mind, he's saying, you know what? The good and the bad, God is doing all of it. And you don't bother changing it or trying to change it because only God can do that. But I'm not so sure if I want to assign that much to God. I mean, all the good I do. But things like sin, I think we're responsible for our sins. And we brought a lot of trouble into the world. But it looks like Kohelet is saying, if God has messed it up, don't you try to fix it, or you can't fix it. Only God can do that. Now, to be sure, God does bring calamity and judgment on people when they've done things, but he might be overgeneralizing here. And I think one of the things that we can learn is that, just like Job, who was a wise man, he didn't have the perspective that he needed until God revealed himself toward the end, right? He wasn't privy to what was happening at the beginning, this conversation between the Satan and the divine council. He wasn't privy to that. And I think oftentimes when you read Ecclesiastes, you're going to see that the perspective, it's all over the place. But one of the things that clues us in on is that Kohelet just thinks everything is almost the way it is. It's just written in stone. Nature is just, you just have to face it. God's done it. You can't change it. Just deal with it. And sometimes he gets things right, and sometimes I think he gets things wrong. Insofar as it's true that God doesn't tempt with evil and can't be tempted with evil, and he is not the author of sin, I'm going to push back on the teacher. But insofar as God is sovereign, amen to that. Okay? Any thoughts or comments? Did I make that really muddy, that verse? So verse 14 says, when times are good, be happy, but when times are bad, consider this. God has made the one as well as the other. Therefore, no one can discover anything about the future. Boy, it sounds very hopeless. But one of the things I think he's saying is that carpe diem, seize the day. Seize the day. He says, when times are good, be happy. Seize the day. But when times are bad, consider this. You know, God is still in charge. I'm not going to make God the author of sin, but sometimes trials do come into our life at the hand of God. So I don't want to dismiss that either. I mean, and people need to accept both good and bad situations in life, and recognizing they are dependent on God. God is the one that we depend on. And we can't see, this is where that perspective thing is coming in. Notice this, it says, no one can discover anything about the future. Well, what he's saying is something kind of like what God said to Job, but in reverse. God said to Job, where were you when I hung the moon? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? You don't have the perspective. Remember, Job was like, why are all these bad things happening? And God's response is, well, first of all, you don't know as much as you think you do. You lack the perspective that I possess. I was the creator. I was there at the beginning. And for you to understand why you're in the situation you're in right now, is the way it is, you'd have to know every antecedent event that led up to this particular moment. And yet, a finite mind can't grasp that. And so what was neat about it is that, of course, Job said, hey, he encounters God. He covers his mouth. He's like, okay, I realize my perspective is wrong, and it's enough I've seen you. And he trusted that. But part of the reason he got called on the carpet was he thought he saw things correctly. Remember, and I'm going back to another bit of wisdom literature in Job, but he wanted an umpire to judge between him and God. But the reason was, and we have this happen sometimes too, have you ever had those bad, horrible things happen in your life where you're kind of like, this makes no sense, God, I didn't do anything for this to happen, and I need an umpire, someone to judge between us. And it may just be the case that we lack the perspective that we need because we don't know all the things that led up to this event. Now, that's going from the past to the present. in this verse is talking about we can't know anything about the future. Only God is able to suss out all of those things. I mean, and so in many ways we have to trust his perspective and not our own. I'm not saying you can't know anything about the future or the past. I'm just saying that we have a very myopic perspective. We are very nearsighted. So, and this is true about Kohelet, or the teacher. You're going to all be saying Kohelet after tonight's class because verse 15, in this meaningless life of mine, I have seen both of these. Wow. He says, I've seen the righteous perishing in their righteousness and the wicked living long in their wickedness. Well, what is he doing right now? He is challenging the traditional view of Proverbs and the ancient Near Eastern view of I'm trying to avoid a fancy word here. There was this idea, reflexive idea. Remember Job's friends? I keep going back to Job. They said, you must have done something wrong, those so-called friends. The view is something like this. I was going to say theodicy, but a theodicy is an explanation for why there can be an all-powerful, all-good God, and yet there is evil. Well, the theodicy back then was only bad things happen to bad people, and good things are supposed to happen to good people. And if you're good and something bad happens to you, it means you weren't good. Well, this is being challenged. He's contradicting the general tenor of the book of Proverbs. Proverbs, wisdom has built a nice house. You do this, this will happen. It's very nice and clean. Ecclesiastes, the house is dilapidated. And he's saying, I've seen, actually, it isn't the righteous that the righteous always prosper and the wicked always live a short life. I mean, the general view is that if you're wicked, you cut short your life. And I think that's generally true. But this guy is saying, I've actually seen the righteous perishing while they're being righteous. And I've watched the wicked live a long life in their wickedness. And if you don't think that's right, just open your eyes and look around the world. I know some dictators that lived a very long time. I knew a dictator, I didn't know him personally, but we took in a young man from Togo when I was living in Cleveland, Tennessee, as a refugee. He came over, he managed to get a visa for a Christian event that was going on, but the dictator, who had been there at that time 30 years in power, there was only one university in the whole country, he sent soldiers in to shoot, because the students were protesting about not having books and things. He sent soldiers in and just shot up the whole university. And this guy escaped with his life. And when he got over here, we worked hard to make sure he didn't have to go back. And he learned English in my house. He started out working a job in washing cars, getting paid cash in the wintertime, which the Togolese people never see winter. And I mean, he was very skinny, and he had a hard time. But do you know God prospered him? And he's an English professor, earned his PhD, and he teaches English literature at University of Tennessee Wesleyan. But I watched this unfold. But my point is this: bad things do happen to the righteous, and sometimes the wicked stay in power way too long. So, why? Well, the reason is part of the reason is this. Is that sin hasn't been finally dealt with. In principle, what Jesus did on the cross deals with sin, but the effects aren't eradicated until Jesus returns. Now, you might say, why wait so long? And it seems to me that part of it is soul development, that people develop their souls, that is, through experiencing hardships and things. We're not bubble wrapped. And there's a reason why we're not bubble wrapped. It's because encountering things is one of the things that beings like us, meaning temporal beings that are constantly in process, we need those things to shape us in some ways. They do shape us. God takes what the enemy means for bad and he'll turn it for good. But there is a teleological end. And so remember how he says, keep the end view in mind? Jesus is returning. And what he did on the cross has accomplished in principle what will be actualized when he returns. So, the cross is leading to consummation. We're not there yet. It's inaugurated but not consummated. And when we get there, every tear is going to be wiped and everything's going to be set aright. But, we're in a probationary period right now. And part of it is soul development. That's not all. There are bad things that happen, and it's not just soul development. It's just, anyway. So you get this weird command, do not be over righteous, neither be over wise. Why destroy yourself? Do not be over wicked, and do not be a fool. Why die before your time? Now, he just says the righteous sometimes die in the righteousness, and wicked live long life. So don't try to be over righteous, and don't try to be over wicked. I've never even heard the word over wicked before. What's he saying? He might be saying that since things don't work out according to some kind of cause and effect, like Proverbs, be moderate. He's not saying, you can be a little bit wicked, just not too much wicked. He's not trying to say that. What he's calling for is a kind of moderation. And it's a warning against relying on wisdom and righteousness for prolonged life and happiness. If you're relying on your wisdom and your righteousness for a long life and happiness, you're in for a rude awakening. It's just not going to happen like that. And if you go back to chapter 2, verse 15, he talks about that. The person who relies on his or her own wisdom or righteousness for a happy, prosperous life is going to be sadly disappointed. So that's what he's getting at. It's not permission to be somewhat wicked, but a warning against wickedness and recognizing that all of us do have this in us. Do you know that? That we're simultaneously, there's a fancy Latin phrase that, what is it, simul et peccator, who knows this one? We're simultaneously righteous and sinful. Do you know that wise people do sinful things? So don't get too cocky with it. Righteous people do sinful things, and wise people do foolish things sometimes. What he's trying to say is avoid these extremes. And have you ever met anybody like that? Super wise, the sage, or very righteous? How do you feel when you're around an overly righteous person? Particularly if it's self-righteous. So he's warning against these extremes and saying, hey, life, you might be righteous, but you're going to mess up. And you might be wise, but you're going to drop the ball sometimes and be foolish. So don't try to build your identity around being the perfection of either one of these, because you're not. And it is good to grasp the one and not let go of the other. Whoever fears God will avoid all extremes. In other words, we are completely dependent on God. If we are wise or righteous, it's not going to be our own. And we can't make being the wisest person or the most righteous person our source of obtaining life. Actually, we derive life from God alone. Fear the Lord. Wisdom is valuable, but death will cancel any advantage it provides. Just so you know. And wisdom makes one wise person more powerful than 10 rulers in a city. There's just this idea that wisdom does bring power. Indeed, there is no one on earth who is righteous, no one who does what is right and never sins. This is just a reminder of what I've already said here. We don't get too cocky with it. And don't be surprised. The worst thing in the world, and I used to be this guy. I was brought up in a holiness tradition, and every time I sinned, I had to get saved again. And I tried to live a righteous life, but the problem was I ended up striving in myself very often. And at a certain point, have you ever met an all or nothing person? I was talking to a person today who says that when she thinks she's right about something, and she doesn't get her way and the other people don't think it's right, she wants to take her bat and go home. I'm going to take my toys and go home. Or have you ever failed as a Christian? So you need to avoid the impulse, the temptation to just it's all or nothing. I guess I just need to give up. Because you can do that. I've done that before. I was like, well, if I'm going to sin, if I can't live completely right, I might as well enjoy sin while I can, because I'm going to hell. Okay. I've been there. I was a 13-year-old. I got saved in a storefront church at age 13. I don't even remember the sermon. A friend of mine from school invited me there. I just remember the preacher giving an altar call and saying, your friends can laugh you into hell, but they can't laugh you back out. So I hit the altar. And they were a well-meaning church, but it was fire and brimstone, turn or burn every second. And I knew nothing about grace or anything. And I'm 13, I'm going through puberty. Every bad thought I thought I had to get saved again. And at a certain point, I don't know how many months in I was like, I guess I'm going to hell. So I just gave up. It's that extreme. You need to be careful about that. That, you know what? You fall down 7 times, get up 8. By God's grace. By God's grace. So, verse 21. Do not pay attention to every word people say, or you may hear your servant cursing you. For you know in your heart that many times you yourself have cursed others. What is this guy saying? Well, remember earlier I said watch out for the flattering tongue, that polluted praise. It can manipulate. Here's another thing. You don't want to hang on to praise too much, but you also don't want to hang on to criticism too much. Because you've got to watch out. I hate it when people criticize me. But ministry, you're like a Teflon coated rhino, thick-skinned and slick-skinned. It needs to slide off of you and not be able to penetrate. This is the way God has called us to be. If you get overly obsessed with other people's criticisms, you will end up living your life for them, and it will be miserable. I don't want to live for people's compliments, and I don't want to live for their criticisms. It's a very bad imbalance. And has anyone ever been a victim of that? We give feedback as preachers. Preachers hear this a lot. This is one of your better sermons, Pastor, which implies there were so many of them that weren't so good, You don't want to live for that, So what I would say is keep short accounts. Don't listen to people who are criticizing you so much. Don't pay everything. Gossip is a terrible. Don't listen in. Don't be a part of gossip. Gossip is. There's nothing good that comes out of gossip. Listening to gossip is borrowing trouble. It just is. Whether you're the one gossiping, or you're hearing people gossip, it's just not a good thing. And we know in our hearts that we've done this. Why should you be so surprised that people are critical of you or curse you? We've done it. And if people gossip about you, you've probably gossiped about people too. Now, we shouldn't be doing it, but we also shouldn't be surprised by it. So let's be careful about that. Don't be surprised. Let's see here. Are we learning something here? Is it? I don't know if I'm just up here babbling at this point. So let's not gossip. Let's not badmouth people. We don't want to do that. But also, if you're the recipient of it, don't let it sideline you. All this I tested by wisdom and said, I am determined to be wise, but this was beyond me. Whatever exists is far off and most profound. Who can discover it? So, he's saying, I've made my life I've ordered my life in such a way that I am determined to be wise. And yet, it's beyond me. There are so many things that go on into the world. This is just the point God made to Job. We just don't have the right perspective, so we can miss out on it and miss out on what was really going on. So wisdom has its limitations. Let me just say it that way. Human wisdom has its limitations, and that's what these verses are about. He said, so I turn my mind to understand, to investigate and to search out wisdom and the scheme of things, and to understand the stupidity of wickedness and the madness of folly. I find more bitter than death the woman who is a snare, whose heart is a trap, and whose hands are chains. Then the man who pleases God will escape her, but the sinner she will ensnare. Now, two things possibly going on here, but one of this evokes a common feature of wisdom literature. It's the personification of wisdom and foolishness. Remember the two women? If you go to Proverbs chapter 9, verses 1 through 18, you're going to see wisdom personified as a woman and foolishness personified as a woman. And so he may be tapping into that foolishness is a snare. It will entrap you. But the man who pleases God will escape her, that is foolishness, but the sinner she will ensnare. Now, of course, if this is Solomon or someone in the Solomonic tradition where he's taken on Solomon's characteristics, how many women did he have? And do you think he was very good at picking them? I mean, I think this will answer something a little later. Look says, Kohelet, or the teacher, this is what I have discovered. Adding one thing to another to discover the scheme of things while I was still searching but not finding. I found one upright man among 1,000. He's not saying that that's the proportion exactly. What he's saying, it's rare to find someone who's upright, but not one upright woman among them all. Ouch. Is this some kind of misogynistic thing he's throwing out there? It could be a person, some people have argued this is a kind of a patriarchal kind of thing, but actually it might just be that this guy's been looking, especially if it were Solomon, he was looking in all the wrong places. He was hooking up with women to forge alliances, and they were idolaters and all these other kinds of things. So I wonder what his motives were. Maybe this guy had a hard time finding an upright woman. I'm not denying they're rare. Upright men and women are both rare. But it could just be he was looking in all the wrong places. Don't be surprised if you're trying. I've heard stories where this is, if you look in the wrong place, if you're fishing in a cesspool, don't be surprised if the fish you catch is not what you expected. It's going to smell a little bit. And this goes for men and women, right? So I wonder, Kohelet here, I'm not sure about this guy sometimes, but I wonder what his motives were. He never found an upright woman. He only found 1 in 1,000 men that were upright. But he says, this only have I found. God created mankind, or humankind, upright, but they have gone in search of many schemes, and that's the problem. Humans come up with all kinds of schemes and devices. Men and women do this. We're constantly scheming. God created Adam and Eve sinless, but not perfect. And there's a difference. I mean, they were sinless, but they still had to grow and mature. When I think of perfection, you see, you can be absolutely sinless, but that doesn't make you perfect. They still had to develop, and they made wrong choices. They're scheming, thinking that they could be like God, or that they knew better than God, or trusting their own judgment more than God, setting themselves up as the center, choosing to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Their scheming got them nowhere but pain. And all of us. So they were sinless, but they weren't perfect. Humans are not perfect, certainly not in the way that God is perfect, even if you were sinless. But God created everything good and very good. We messed it up, and this is the world Kohelet lives in. And this is the world that we live in. And it's the teacher saying, get a grasp of it, pay attention to it. Things are not idealistic. This is cynicism, this is realism, this is maybe a little pessimism, assaulting a foolish optimism. And you can get some optimistic things from, you really have to wring the rag really hard to get optimism out of the book of Ecclesiastes. You can find it. But what you're getting a real dose of, if you want real optimism, go to Proverbs or somewhere else. But for those who get too enamored with Proverbs or the very happy passages, here's a dose of reality. It's a reality check. So what can we learn? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's see here. Not now. Now I have to go through this whole thing again, I think. I am going to go here. And I'm going to go here. And here's what we can learn. So, verses 1 through 14. Contemplating our mortality has benefits. It's sobering, and it should cause us to seize the day. We need to redeem the time. It's short. Outer and inner realities are often very different. A person could look straight-faced or sad-faced and yet have joy in their heart. And yet another person could be pasting on a smile, but in agony on the inside. Only God can see the in from the out and the end from the beginning. And we lack God's perspective. Sometimes we wonder, why is it like this? I could have done a better job than this. I mean, or, we can't make sense of reality because our optimism bumped into reality. Our optimism bumped into realism, and we suddenly are like at a loss. What do we do? Well, it may be because we lack God's perspective. Even Kohelet, the teacher, seemed to miss it sometimes. And then finally, the verses 15 through 29, we must modestly acquire virtue in moderation. And what I mean is this. When you first get saved, you're ready to conquer the world for Jesus. You actually have a lot more zeal than you have wisdom most of the time. And we do foolish things, or we're like the kid I heard about my professor telling one time that when he got into school, God made a way for him to go to school. He promised God that he'd make straight A's. But how many know that may not be a promise you can keep? He went when he got his first exam back, or one of his exams, he went to the professor and said, "Professor, I need you to change my grade. I had promised God that I was going to make straight A's if he got me into school." And the professor was like, maybe God didn't ever expect you to make that promise. We need to be careful about the vows we make. That was last lesson, right? I guess Steve must have. We need to be careful about that. So we need to do this with humility, modestly, and with moderation. Don't try to be super sage, or don't try to be super righteous, because you can fool yourself, because usually it's in your own effort, and the only person that you're deceiving is yourself. And wisdom and righteousness are not the same, and sometimes people think they are. Some people think if they just get enough wisdom, if I learn enough about the Bible or whatever, or these things, I'm somehow made righteous. No, you could just be a very knowledgeable fool or unrighteous man. And but alternatively, just because you've been made the righteousness of God in Christ Jesus, don't think that's an excuse for being lazy and not acquiring wisdom. Because there are a lot of saved and foolish people in the world. And we will be disappointed if we rely on our own wisdom and righteousness. Because a lot of times we tend to sub God's wisdom and righteousness out for our wisdom and righteousness. And finally, if you haven't figured it out already, because Kohelet constantly refrains this, wisdom has its limits. You're going to reach a ceiling sooner or later. Some people reach it sooner than others. You're going to bump your head, and you can't go any higher. And wisdom or knowledge, both, the Bible says knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If you walk out with all the wisdom and knowledge in the world and you don't have love, you are a very foolish person. So, enough said. Those are the takeaways. Any questions, thoughts, comments, concerns? I know I need to apologize to the online crowd. If I knew how to fix this problem, I would have fixed it. But I do not have the wisdom that one would expect technologically for me to have done this. It's the first time it's ever happened, so I am very sorry. I hope that you got something out of it. Questions, comments, concerns, observations about any of this? You guys are very quiet tonight. Are you this quiet with Steve? Okay. Well, he doesn't allow you to talk back, does he? No. Did you tell him that he needs to listen more than he talks? You heard that, Steve? All right, let me pray for you. If you don't have any pressing question or an observation you want to share, I'll pray and we'll be out 15 minutes early.
I have a question.
Sure.
You mentioned Proverbs book is a book of maxims. You said
Maxims. Or a maxim, I'll give you a lot of synonyms. Maxim, truism, aphorism, proverb. They're all the same thing, kind of. But what are maxims and truisms. Think about a truism. Now, there are some things that are true all the time. Triangles always have 3 sides. But a truism is something, you know what, generally speaking, if you do the maintenance on your car, it's not going to break down. But is that always true? I received my car brand new. I have always and forever done the maintenance at the place that it was bought from. And do you know that they're going to have to replace the bottom half of my engine? And this was, at 50-something thousand miles, they realize it because there's some kind of manufacturer defect. But I did all the right things. But so generally, if you do the right things, you're going to have a pretty trouble-free car existence. But so a maxim is something, so when I say proverbs or maxims, those are divinely inspired maxims, things that generally hold true. But the problem is this is how Christians get into trouble. Now, there are other things in the Bible that are not maxims at all. They're just straight truth, and they're always true. Jesus is Lord, period. But if you take a maxim and you try to make it true at all times everywhere, and you believe that God inspired it to be at all times everywhere and not just a maxim, you're going to have some problems. You're just going to run into problems. Proverbs, I believe the Bible's 100% inspired. The book of Proverbs is no exception. It was just inspired to be maxims. Does this make sense? All right. Let me pray for you. God, I thank you so much for your word. I thank you for your wisdom and your righteousness because in and of ourselves, God, we don't really have any, and we fool ourselves. God, I pray that you help us not be a people that offers up polluted praise, Lord, that we don't become obsessed about what other people think, fear man, whether it's we're worried about their criticisms or maybe we're just too enamored with their compliments. God, let us not be those people. Help us to fear you. Help us to love you. Help us to demonstrate your love to the world. Make us wise people. Help us live out a righteous life, not in our strength, but in yours. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.